So anyway, I had I don't know if you got the message last week. You know, I wanted to do some Lukacs today, make a move a little bit to Korsch, but concentrate somewhat on the Adorno piece called "Why Still Philosophy," because I think this was written in '62. So we have a piece from two pieces from 1923. And then one from 1962, and this was a radio address that Adorno gave called "Why Still Philosophy." So hopefully you had a chance to at least look at it. I'll try to, give some kind of problematization to it. To go back just for a second, and I hope some of the notes help.
And if we want to make change, we want to progress.
It just said progress.
I know, I heard it.
These two realms, once again, one is really in the sensible world of appearances. The other one is in what Kant will ultimately call the intelligible, right? And this is an opposition that goes on in Kantian dualism throughout. And again, what Lukacs is trying to do is take both of these together and bring them together. So when he begins to talk about the phenomenal world of reification, or the phenomenon of reification, again, it's through the world of appearances, and that's what's just given to us through sense data, through our sensibility, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the new Emil, the X, is he's trying to make that more intelligible, what's behind, and he's using, obviously, his starting point is Marx's commodity structure and the commodification of all things, and how the commodity fetish itself becomes the hidden new Emil realm that he's trying to bring to the fore as the central problem facing, Marxist philosophy. So Lukacs is a very, in the tradition, is the first reader to really focus on Capital Volume 1 and to read the commodity. Plekhanov, Lenin, and others in the tradition before him never really went to this depth in terms of philosophical analysis, and this is one of the reasons I think he himself, Lukacs, thought himself to be the great Marxist philosopher of the 20th century. He says he will be remembered, he said this late in his life, I am the Marxist philosopher of the 20th century, because he's the one that problematized this. Again, I emphasize that he wrote not only on epistemological questions, which we're sort of dealing with here, how do we know, what are the conditions for the possibilities of our knowledge and the production of that knowledge. But he also wrote on aesthetics, the specificity of the aesthetics. He wrote an aesthetics called the Heidelberg aesthetics. Then he wrote an ontology late in life, which I mentioned last week, which was, began with Hegel, Marx. Well, he actually began with the current situation, which was neo-positivism and existentialism, the two currents that were dominant. And we'll go back around to that a little bit with Adorno, because for Adorno, those are two major antagonists, right? In Adorno's case, more Heideggerian existentialism, and Lukacs more Sartrean existentialism. And and also someone who's a first-rate essayist, as I mentioned last week, the Balzac essay, to me, is one of my favorite, essays in literary criticism on Lucien Rampere and Lost Illusions of Balzac. So, anyway, the new Emil Rem in Kant has really no existence. So what Hegel does is try to put these together, right, into one. There's nothing that is beyond our comprehension of objects in the world, etc. Nothing beyond that. And what this is really trying to do in another dimension, and what we can look at Kant as representing is, Kant is sort of thought of as the Copernican revolution in thinking. And the Copernican revolution in thinking, although to me it begins with Descartes and the orientation of the subject, is Kant begins with subjectivity. Again, right? how is it that we, the subject, the thinking processes, we accompany all our representations, right? This is what he really tries to ground philosophy back in, is this subject I that thinks, that accompanies all its representations. This is the synthetic unity of apperception. And this is taking place through, for lack of a better term, through the ego, but really through the I self. So it's the unity of our apperception of things in the world, right? That the thinking self is apprehending all these objects in the world in a representative sense, you know? Now, so one of the criticisms is what happens to the presentative without the you know? Again, the new Emil realm, in a sense, and why this dualism. So for Hegel, he tries to make this a presentation of objects as they are in the now time of the moment. Okay, so anyway, again, going way back to Descartes, the subject that I thinks, the cogito, right, the cogito becomes not the thinking in existence, but thinking and representation in Kant, right? And this is the readventation of subjectivity. When we get to Adorno, I'll talk a little bit. Adorno sees Kant's revolution much more differently than the tradition of subjectivity. He sees Kant really making a move to the objectivity of all things, right? That this is his really great contribution in terms of solving the rational, I think, with the empirical sense data. You know, this is, of course, empiricism, right? In a way that we only know through our senses. We only know through sensibility, you know. And this is Hume. You know, I recommend Deleuze's first book that's published on Hume called Empiricism and Subjectivity. Very, very good book of Deleuze's that very few people read. Deleuze started as a Humean, then a Bergsonian, then a Nietzschean, and then a Deleuzian himself later on. Okay, so let's go over the text of Lukacs a little bit. Again, as I mentioned in my notes that were posted last night, I'm sorry it's so late for them, but you know, I'll try to get them out earlier this week. If you read, and you know, if you have this entire book, I think it's very important to read section 3 of Orthodox Marxism. I should have assigned it, but if you can, this will really, I think, deepen your notion of Lukacs, the concept of totality. So pages 10 through 15 on the concept of totality. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this to kind of attune us, and then we'll go to the phenomena of reification. So he begins here with the dialectical conception of totality. And this is on page 10. Seems to have put a great distance between itself and reality. It appears to construct reality very unscientifically. But it is the only method, and this is Lukacs speaking, methodologically, capable of understanding and reproducing reality. So again, this concept of the totality, you know, is crucial in Lukacs, and this will be criticized later by the Althuserians. You know, we'll speak about that when we get to Althusser. But the concept of totality is the central methodological category for Lukacs. The concept of the totality, and this is where the attack was. By the way, Martin J., a book on Marxism and totality, this is his starting point. He's the one who wrote the first book on the Frankfurt School, the dialectical imagination, a historian at Berkeley. Okay, so page 10, The Dialectical Imagination is the name of Jay's book. It's a very good introduction. It's dated, but it's a very good introduction to the Frankfurt School, and also looking at a relationship to Lukacs in this respect. Okay, so concrete totality is therefore the category that governs reality. The rightness of the view only emerges with complete clarity when we direct our attention to the real material substratum of our method, that is, capitalist society. I was going to say Catholic with a capitalist, but anyway, with its internal antagonism between the forces and relations of production, and everybody knows the standard Marx, thing that forces and relations of production are always in this dialectical relation, that our social relations are somewhat shaped, and by what mode of production we are, dominated by, and what forces of production are at work. So, for example, what's going on out there is a direct, indication of how new forces of production, right, vis-a-vis technology, and the dissemination of this is shaping new social relations vis-a-vis internet communication and, new forms of communication that we have. Anyway, all right, so the methodology, and this is very interesting, of the natural sciences, which forms the methodological ideal of every fetishistic science and every kind of revisionism, rejects the idea of contradiction and antagonism in its subject matter. And this is something that I think, again, we talked a little bit about how the left relinquished freedom to the right. One of the reasons the left relinquished that freedom is it could no longer really tolerate the contradictions and put itself in an antagonistic dialectic. This is sort of my thinking about this, that the left was really on the way towards a kind of reformism, which was, a kind of mild or a moderate dialectic as late as, as early as the late 70s, and now with the result of this now coming back up in terms of protest and resistance movements, but not really a whole lot of thinking. Where are the force of contradictions in the society, and are we going to position ourselves in a real antagonistic dialectic? And we can see this in all these new movements, right? The social democratic forces are not anti-capitalist. It's not an antagonistic dialectic. The thing about the Frankfurt School, like them or not in terms of activism or what they do on the streets, there is completely this antithetical, relationship to capitalism. They are thoroughly anti-capitalist. Now, Lukacs, in his case, has been accused of romantic anti-capitalism, the romantic being a product of German romanticism, and Lukacs' earlier background with Novalis and the early Hegel and these kind of things. But at another level, there's always this underlying tendency of all the thinkers we're reading, in this class, of a complete anti-capitalist moment and not being afraid of the contradictions. And as Stanley rightfully pointed out vis-a-vis Althusser, that even after the revolutions, the contradictions will be there. The ideology remains. There will still be conflict, and there are many levels to contradiction. We'll go over that when we get to Althusser. There are formal, material contradictions. There are certainly rational contradictions and pragmatic contradictions, and we'll try to work this out, as we go a little forward. But the main thing to remember here is that this is an antagonistic dialectic that he's speaking about, right? We are outside completely the system.
Lenin, I read in my Wikipedia notes, for better or for worse, Lenin accused him of left communism. Is that
accused
right?
Lukacs of left wing, left communism,
Which is in that famous book of his, which I read, and it's very, the left wing disorder.
Yeah, but it wasn't Lukacs who was the antagonist there. It was more the Kotsky factor.
It was Korsch?
And
right.
Korsch was part of the object.
Then they're wrong what they said in the notes.
Okay. Well, Lukacs may have been grouped in that in some senses, but he was not. Lukacs defended history and class consciousness, and then wrote the little monograph on Lenin to make sure he had been, not misunderstood. In this regard. So anyway, it's good to sometimes. Look, Lenin as philosopher is a difficult subject matter to get to. We don't really have time to read his notes. They're notes, really, basically. They're notebooks on Hegel. It's like what we do, taking notes in a sense, although this was a very different activity of mine that was always looking for practical application in the world. But it was never, Lenin never really considered himself to be a philosopher. And I'm not trying to separate out the two, but Lukacs is dealing with a philosophical tradition here where he's trying to both integrate and begin to see the seeds of a Marxist philosophy, and the concept on which it's built is totality. That's why I'm going to, start there, right? And that concept of totality is a methodological moment, right? Okay? So, anyway, if despite this contradictions do spring up between particular theories, this only proves, excuse me, that our knowledge is yet imperfect. Contradictions between theories show that these theories have reached their natural limits and therefore must be transformed and subsumed under wider theories in which the contradictions ultimately disappear. Again, this is the Hegelian, I emphasize this again, this is his mind at work, which works like a Hegelian, the Aufhebung, the spiraling effect of suppression, retention, lifting to a higher plane, and what is the residue that remains there, yeah? Those of you that read the philosophy of history, you can see a lot of Hegel in the Benjamin notion of history, that you have this past that flits up, and the Angelus Novus as an icon is very much of a Hegelian figure, if you will, in history. Very much that looks both to the past but to the future simultaneously, in some ways. So again, this is not a rupture. It is not a complete break, right? It is, a more of a, I put it this way, an evolutionary, revolutionary kind of spiral, where things are being retained from the Kantian past, from the Hegelian, as you're going forward in a kind of new dialectic that's grounded in the material substratum. So, so keep that in mind. And okay, so let's look at this. He gives a very good example. I'm not going to read all of this, obviously. Page 11, the method of classical economics was a product of this ideological need, right? But it's also its limitations as a science are a consequence of the structure of capitalist reality and the antagonistic character of capitalist production. When, for example, a thinker of David Ricardo's stature can deny the necessity of expanding the market along with the expansion of production and the growth of capital, he does so unconsciously, of course, to avoid the necessity of admitting that crises are inevitable, right? Right. For crises are the most striking illustration of the antagonism in capitalist production, and it is evident that the bourgeois mode of production implies a limitation to the free development of the forces of production. What was good faith in Ricardo becomes a consciously misleading apologia of bourgeois economics, right? In the writings of the vulgar economists. So the vulgar Marxists, the economic determinists, that is, arrived at the same result by seeking either the thoroughgoing elimination of dialectics from proletarian science, or at best its critical refinement. And then he gives the example of the social democrat Max Adler, how this actually happens in history, right? Right? And he does say at the bottom, the objective economic antagonism, about 9 lines down about Adler, as expressed in the class struggle, evaporates. What happens in the Social Democrats is the class structure and the class struggle no longer is really operative, right? In a way, right? It does not, leaving only a conflict between the individual and society, right? It's all bad out there. Just give me my little share. What does my wages and benefits package look like from the union? Never the class struggle of union should go back to pre-1935 and, start thinking through what they mean and what their culture means, etc. Right? So this means that neither the emergence of internal problems nor the collapse of capitalist society can seem to be necessary. The end product, whether he likes it or not, is a Kantian philosophy of history. We'll reach a teleological point where a kingdom of ends will emerge, right, and a kind of utopia. And I'll try to bring this up vis-a-vis Benjamin next week about how Kantian somehow the messianic conception of history is too. It might not be as Marxist as we really think. So we'll try to engage that too. I'm sorry, I'm going back to the previous class. They were reading the thesis on the philosophy of history. Moreover, the structure of bourgeois society is structured as the universal form of society in general. It's presupposed. There's no alternative. It's the way it is, right?
The end of history? That
Yes,
applies?
the end of history of Fukuyama and company, which was very conveniently done at the time of the first Iraq War, if you remember.
Yeah.
Not only was it capitalist triumphalism, it was a way of also justifying that triumphalism has to fight wars all over the place and still maintain 2,800 and change military bases around the world. Your big real estate, your landlord, the Pentagon, largest landlord in the world. Right? Moreover, the structure, is established as uniform. For the central problem tackles of the real dialectics or better antagonists, nothing but the typical ideological forms of the capitalist order. So when we talk about reforms and reformism, this is really what Lukacs is going after. Again, because this is a revolutionist at work, whether you subscribe to his way of going about revolutionary thinking, it certainly is revolution against reform. There's no place for social democratic reform here. This would be a joke to him that we're talking about Medicare and programs in the 60s today. I mean, I understand where we are and what we're dealing with in this country.
For him, they're
but-
stopgaps.
Yeah, they're just at best, on a good day, right? and aren't really that dialectical. In a way. There are stopgaps that really smack of a kind of positivism in a sense, right? In many ways, all right? Thus the whether capitalism is rendered immortal or on economic and ideological grounds, and this is very good. That capitalism is an eternal system, he's taking this on, or with critical refinement is of little importance. I think this is a very beautiful summation of the reformist tendency of social democracy. Whether capitalism is considered triumphal and eternal, or can it be, dealt with some critical refinement. Right, we got this bill passed in the House. We got this.
Right.
We got this person elected, et cetera, et
Making
cetera.
progress.
Yes, and the notion of progress, as both Adorno, Benjamin, and of course, Nietzsche, to me, is the great leveler of progress. And but anyway, that's another story. Okay, thus with the repetition and the blurring of the dialectical methods, history becomes unknowable. History becomes this unknowable X, and ultimately becomes almost a Christian version of the kingdom of ends, in Kant's, notion, right? In many ways. This does not imply that a more or less exact account of particular people or epochs cannot be given without the aid of dialectics, but it does put paid to attempts to understand history as a unified process. This can be seen in the sociological abstract, historical constructs, and Herbert Spencer and Auguste Comte, the positivist, whose inner contradiction convincingly exposed by modern bourgeois historians, by Heinrich Ricard, most insightfully. But it also shows in the demand for a philosophy of history, which then turns out to have a quite inscrutable relationship to historical reality. The opposition between the description, and this is very good on history, of an aspect of history and the description of history as a unified process is not just a problem of scope, as in the distinction between particular and universal history, and this will go back to Benjamin, he'll distinguish this too in the thesis. It is rather a conflict, therefore, of method and of approach. So we're beginning to see the approach of the historical materialist approach to history, right? Right here. Whatever the epoch or specific topic of study, the question of a unified approach to the process of history is inescapable, and it is here that the crucial importance of the dialectical view of totality reveals itself. For it is perfectly possible for someone to describe the essentials of a historical event and yet be in the dark about the real nature of the event and its function in the historical totality. That is, without understanding it as a part of the unified historical process. Okay? Now, any questions? I mean, I'm trying to, at least read it out loud so we can attune ourselves to this notion of totality and unified process of history, and that this is going to go well beyond the standard descriptive, critical, and analytical approaches to history, right? This is about trying to find out the real nature of the essential relations that make up a particular epoch, right? And a particular, period, if you will, as well. So he goes on to Simondi's treatment of the question of crisis. This is all over Marx, Proudhon's false dialectics, and this is Marx speaking. He converts the various limbs of society into so many independent societies. Again, the unity of the totality. We don't need to know about the anarchists in Bushwick and the communists on, 320 West 37th Street. This is not doing us any favors about, the limbs, right, in the independent society, right? We repeat, Lukacs says, at the bottom, page 12, the category of totality does not reduce its various elements to undifferentiated uniformity, that is, to identity. The apparent independence and autonomy which they possess in the capitalist system of production is an illusion only insofar as they are involved in a dynamic, dialectical relationship with one another and can be thought of as the dynamic, dialectical aspects of an equally dynamic and dialectical whole. The result we arrive at, says Marx, is not that production, and this is from the Critique of Political Economy, the beginning of the introduction to the Grundrisse, is that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption are identical, but that they are all members of one totality. When you look at an economy, you're not just looking at consumer society. You're not only looking at the latest production figures, the labor statistics, et cetera, et cetera. You're looking at all four: production, distribution, consumption, and exchange, all at once in a kind of unified whole. Thus, a definite form of production determines definite forms of of consumption, distribution, exchange, as well as definite relations between these different elements. A mutual interaction takes place between these various elements. This is the case with every organic body. That's Marx himself speaking, right? Very, very important, this notion of the totality that he is taking directly from Marx, from the Marx of the middle period, if you want to consider it that way, the intermundi between the Marx of the early humanist phase all the way to the Marx of Capital, right? This is the critique of political economy, and again, Marx is not a political economist. He is doing a critique of political economy. He is laying bare the foundations of this discipline from Ricardo, Smith, Sismondi, Proudhon, et cetera, and trying to see it through the totality. If this makes, I'm trying to, put it into what its methodological force is, okay? But even the category, Lukacs goes on, of interaction requires inspection, right? If by interaction we just mean reciprocal causal impact of two otherwise unchangeable objects, mechanical, right here, on each other, we shall not have come an inch nearer to an understanding of society. This is the case with the vulgar materialists with their one-way causal sequences, or the Marxists with their functional relations. After all, there is, for example, an interaction when a stationary billiard bar is struck by a moving one. The first one moves, the second one is deflected from its original path. The interaction we have in mind must be more than the interaction of otherwise unchanging objects. It must go further in relation to the whole, for this relation determines the objective form of every object of cognition. So this is where he and Adorno are very much on the same page about Kant opening up this world of objectivity, right? This is really the Copernican turn, not so much the new subjectivity or the subject that thinks representations. That, for Adorno and Lukacs, is a bourgeois interpretation of Kant, right? Okay? So Yeah, and the reason I start, if you will, with the phenomena new eminal realms here, right? Because he's trying to get to this other realm, right, of the intelligible, to render the intelligible whole, right, in all of this. He's trying to bridge and put these together. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. All right. So anyway, reification contributes to this. This is what we do. We live in reified relations all the time. We don't really think about, what does this mean, all this hype about these people winning in the elections? We don't really think about this in the real sense. We have standard stock phrases to look at it, but we only grasp the nature of it. Do people really talk about what we really witnessed last week or Tuesday was the $5 billion spent on these campaigns, a record,
right,
and this is part of corporate windfall taxes from the previous year, right? Again, the corporate state trying to buy, certain relations. Who didn't take any money in this? Everybody was prone to this kind of, money politics. This was the theme precisely throughout the media, how much money was spent, never about the issues.
Right.
Someone's
Right.
progressive, they for single payer health care, give me a break, in a sense. This is it. Always.
Everybody has to pay to play. Right?
Yeah, pay to play, right? Yeah, something like that. So, you play the lottery? Is that where you got that?
That's what it
Yeah,
is.
of course,
That's the
of course.
essence of it.
Yes, of course, yes. So anyway, what he's really talking about here is the grasping behind the phenomena of reification through this method, if you will, of the totality. What are we grasping in this fetishistic character of everything in our everyday life, in this world of commodities and this process of commodification? And unless we look at this, at least for Lukacs, I'm not saying I agree fully with this, but for Lukacs, unless we begin with a commodity form and its fetishist character, right, and understand these relations between exchange and use value and the fourfold moment that Marx talks about: production, consumption, distribution, and exchange, right? Unless we see this as a unified whole, we're missing, really the essential nature of the system, and therefore cannot really engage in a antagonistic dialectic. We're not really stepping outside or stepping into the system in such a way that we really can see what it's about, right? Mm-hmm. We can hypothesize, but we're not really seeing it. We're not really grasping the essential real relations. This is where he's trying to go here, yeah. And in this piece, what he's really writing longer than the reification chapter on class consciousness is how do you build a class consciousness that is aware of these essential natures, and what processes of articulation can you give to this? How do you begin to see in the totality, right? It's not just about the poor. It's not just about the working class in a sense. It's about the understanding that goes with this that makes much more for the possibility of radical upheaval, insurrection, rather than, just blowing hot air or going the way of revolutionary reform, radical reforms. Or kind of reformism. Because the antagonist really here internally is the reformist social democrats, right? It's not just the right. We have, this is a thing on the left. The left is always very good. You can hold up a big dart show, George W. Bush, big dart show with Donald Trump. How can you miss, blindfolded, right, in your sleep. But, never really talk about the internal relations within the so-called left, right, or among this, and never really the full-fledged critique of the social democratic tendencies, So we always end up speaking about reformist moments, right? This becomes part of the, the citation of the day, right? Isn't that great? So one, I'll play on my favorite straw person, Ocasio. Isn't it wonderful that she won? And then I asked Stanley what he thought of the Native American that won in Dakota. She has nothing to say, Michael. So anyway, this, who knows where these people will end up? Maybe something will take hold. But for right now, it's not anything that has anything to do with the left tradition, really the real left tradition, if you will. At least through its philosophers, its thinkers, and its, it's the real revolutionary practitioners. Yeah, yeah.
And
Please.
for else is there,
Yeah.
the social democrats would be part of the ideological state apparatus, right? Like they would, they sort of help along essentially the constitution of capitalist society.
I think one good way of reading today the ideological state apparatus, the ISA, and kind of modernizing it in a way, is to look at the media to see what are the themes from Democracy Now! To Rachel Maddow. They're basically the same. The same topics in some ways.
Right.
Maybe a different rhetoric to a degree, but there's a commonality of themes, thematics, that really is not subverting, if you will, getting underneath the tendencies, or really grasping the relations.
Yeah.
We'll always get a specialist in, and this is another thing I
Right,
want to
where he
read
ends up,
from
yeah.
Lukacs that's very, very important, how over-specialized we are. And he has a great section on, I'm going to read this as well, a great section about over-specialization. Yes, yeah.
I was just
Yeah,
going to say, the
yeah.
essay in Adorno, he starts off with the critique of specialized knowledge
Yes,
too.
yes, absolutely, yeah. And this is something that we've succumbed to very easily. It's, Chomsky calls it, and rightfully so, the cult of the expert. It's a nice phrase, the cult of the expert, and how we, go through the, yeah.
The cult
So-
of personality is like what.
the cult of personality was a different notion over the years,
Yeah.
but the cult of the expert is the new cult of personality. Look who's on TV, this
Exactly.
ex-general, the expert, who's on TV, this, yeah. And the heroes are now ex-FBI, John Brennan's the hero.
Yeah.
Et cetera, right? Yeah. Like bringing Victor Beria back and putting him on TV. to do
Women from the military
commentary
are
on the
heroes,
gulags.
too.
What? I'm sorry?
NPR wants us to know that women from the military had a lot of successes in the election, and that is a good thing.
Of course.
It is.
Yeah, of course. So, yes, but going back to the ideological state apparatus, Lukacs is trying to grasp real relations here, not the reify. He's trying to get beyond the phenomenon of reification. And the ideological state apparatuses contribute to the general concept, or the general tendency and of reification, in a way. For those of you that don't know, the ideological state apparatuses begin with the family, right? The family makes you sick, Sigmund Freud will make you well. Good
Yeah.
luck. Yeah.
And then it goes
just
to
make it more
Marx,
bearable.
Yeah.
Your family, so to speak, and and then the church again makes you sick, and then you can go to the satanic cults on the other side, to another kind of church, etc. Right. But anyway,
But he does trade
yeah.
unionism and political parties.
Well, that becomes
Social
part
democracy.
of these issues in the educational
Right.
apparatus,
Right.
which is the major apparatus, and people like David Winters, I hope he writes about this going forward, is that the media now seems to have its own ideological apparatus, that may be separate from education. Maybe we need a fourth category, to look at as a part of the state apparatus, right? Yeah, please, yeah.
And do you mean like the research and educational apparatus specific to the media that's then communicated? through the
Yes,
media?
that's part of it, as well as,
They have their own
the
apparatus to
Nielsen
understand
ratings,
the
how
world.
many people are tuned in.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
would
yeah.
have both a quantitative and a qualitative analysis looking at this new apparatus. Apparatus, French, is really framework. It's Heidegger, it's Gestalt. It's how you're framed. This is an interesting concept. The Gestalt is how we're framed, right? And apparatus is the French word that is used for apparatus, for Gestalt, by the German. So this framing up in framing that ensnares us constantly. And this is something that I think is a fourth category that we could use in terms of the ideological state apparatus. Some people say you don't even need the ideological anymore, that the repressive state apparatus, police,
Yeah.
judiciary, all this is enough. You don't even need the ideology anymore. It's so seeped in,
Yeah.
et cetera, and reproduced. I see this in students. I mean, you know, at the undergraduate level, when they first come out of high school, they're so brainwashed. I mean, you know, you have no idea, you know, where to begin in some ways.
They're not
You begin
edu-
with student debt. They're not educated. That goes.
They're not-
Yeah.
They're not educated
They're
at
not even
all,
schooled.
really.
Some of these kids, you know, but you know. So you have this kind of this war, if you will. I mean, you know, the war has been, at least in my mind, over the last 30 years with student debt, how much it costs to go to graduate school, especially for people that are in humanities or in the thinking subjects, not the quote-unquote practical subject matters. You know, there's been a war through, you know, the financing, you know, the student debt crisis, right, as well as a war on what's taught, you know, what's thought about, and time. There's a war against time, always. Yeah, that's what it's really about. Yeah, and so we've had this. So now people get the, you know, the 15-second soundbite. You know, this is a recent time. I didn't have this when I was growing up. You could listen. You wouldn't commercial break. I remember. I'm not advocating for Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide or Howard K. Smith or Huntley Brinkley or these kind of TV programs, but you had 15 minutes of news before they would break to a commercial. Right? There was
Right,
some
right,
continuity.
right.
You had some kind of concentrated force going on. Today, you have 15-second sound bites with CNN.
Right.
You know,
And then- and
I've
then
done
you-
an analysis of this. I've
Right,
sat down with
right.
a piece of paper and a watch on the MSNBC. You know, supposedly you're a liberal voice, right? And cable TV. You know, you get a commercial after a 5-minute monologue in the
Right,
beginning.
right, right.
You get a commercial for 3 minutes, then they come back for 4, then you break again for 3 minutes for commercial. By the time you hit the half an hour, it's more 50-50
Right,
in favor
right.
of the commercials.
Thank goodness for the remote.
Right.
My remote is.
Oh, is that what you changed? Yeah, yeah. Oh, they're
Yeah.
speaking.
You.
of the other-
You,
Yeah,
right.
but
Yeah, not
that's,
the circle.
that,
Yeah.
that's too much content. Scrolling gets rid of that. Then you can go much faster
Okay.
from
all right.
topic to topic. I
That's
mean,
true.
literally.
Accelerate.
Yeah.
I mean,
Anyway, this is
I watch
very
my son watch
under-theorized,
the
by the
news,
way.
And
Yeah.
after 60 seconds,
Yeah.
he's gone to the device
I
because
see.
it's too much.
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah, so go ahead, yeah, I'm just bringing this up, it's a possibility, you
Yeah.
know, to think through, yeah, yeah.
Would you
Yeah.
think of like Lefebvre and Debord as like attempts to theorize their attempts to theorize consumer culture as a place where education sort of occurs as attempts to theorize that sort of fourth dimension of the apparatus? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think they look at that as a possibility, whether or not that's been successful. I mean, Debord, you know, there's graffiti in Paris, abolish all work. You know, never work again in 1953. I mean, here we are working harder than ever
Right.
in 2018. Yeah, I mean, you know, yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, certainly they were there. The Society of the Spectacle is an attempt to look at reification. You know, if you want a rewriting in a very imaginative thing of Lukacs' essay on reification and class consciousness, probably the best starting point is Society of the Spectacle of Debord. If you like, you know, the strategy of the inner text and rethinking and rewriting text, yeah. So Society of the Spectacle is built on 240 propositions. It's built on propositional logic, and it really looks at every form in consumer society of the spectacle that, you know, is commodified. You know, so he's obviously very well aware of this work, you know, and of course of Marx, you know, before. And yeah, so he's rewriting. Needless to say, the Unabomber wrote the Unabomber Manifesto, which is based on the Society of the Spectacle. It's the exact same form, right? And it actually is a rant in the beginning against technology. It's not so bad. I mean, it's a combination of Luddite and you know, Frankfurt School in the beginning. The Unabomber, I'm serious. Yeah.
Didn't you go to Yale or something?
Chicago. Huh?
Chicago, yeah.
I think Chicago. Maybe I'm wrong. Ted
One of his
Kaczynski?
targets was go enter at Yale, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yes, right.
Maybe
right.
that's what it was.
Right, right. So anyway, but that's a good point. I mean, Debord and then Lefebvre in the critique of everyday life, yes, is another way of looking at that. And of course, Stiegler today, who has a big emphasis on consumer culture. Part of the problem, again, going back to Lukacs, is the totality is not really being thought, because the mode of production is not being thought so much. You know, Stiegler's, one thing I like about, and I don't know if you guys have read, some of you, but we have mentioned him in previous classes and read him. Bernard Stiegler, in his Techniques in Time and then his work, he has an institute in Paris called Ars Industrialis, and they study state-of-the-art digital technologies, and he's very much about studying this, this move towards technology. And anyway, he is at least looking at some of the production, but a lot of theorists aren't looking at production. They're not really dealing with the totality. Again, to emphasize, what Lukacs is speaking about, this concept of the totality has gone by the wayside because of an over-specialization. So you'll get these brilliant works on the Maschinaic, by certain theorists, and you get brilliant attempts on zero work, but again, it's not really taking into account all the relations, right? So this is part of the over-specialization, and of course, the drive to publish, the drive to, continually get work out there, a kind of overproduction, if you will. This is one thing that, education's done. It's produced an overproduction, overabundance of everything from PhDs to paper, And, and the older you get, I hope, you begin to underline less, and you begin, I've heard this before, and, okay, whose thesis is this? Oh, yeah, I know, okay, and then you move on quickly, yeah. So anyway, let's go back to this. So the category here is about the organic, really. It's about, understanding the organism called capital, and its politics, and how to do so with a totality. Okay, so if we look down page 13, the intelligibility of objects develops in proportion, last paragraph, as we grasp their function in the totality to which they belong. Right? This is why only the dialectical conception of totality can enable us to understand reality as a social process. Very important. Reality as a social process. Right? Okay? And then when you go to the next page, for only this conception dissolves the fetishistic forms necessarily produced by the capitalist mode of production and enable us to see them as mere illusions, which are not less illusory for being seen to be necessary. These unmediated concepts, these laws, sprout just as inevitably from the soil of capitalism and veil the real relations between objects. They can all be seen as ideas necessarily held by the agents of the capitalist system of production. They are therefore objects of knowledge, but the object which is known through them is not the capitalist system of production, but the ideology of the ruling class. They're very important. Right? Only when this veil is torn aside does historical knowledge become possible. So this is again a reading of the 1845 German ideology, in which ideas, there is such a thing as the ruling class ideology, which takes hold and seeps through everyday life. And in order to get through that, one must grasp this totality of relations between the spheres of production, consumption, distribution, and exchange. And unless you're thinking that all the time, you're not really thinking the real relations in the society.
Right.
In the productivity. Right. This is a workshop, huh? Yeah. Okay. Please. Yeah. Josh. Yeah.
So he's really attacking Kant there in a way too, right? The difference, as the bourgeois philosopher.
Well, Kant is a bourgeois philosopher.
That's what I mean.
Kant is the thinker of the bourgeois revolution, right? He's the thinker of the French Revolution and the bourgeois revolution. I don't want to reduce him only to that,
in the vulgar sense, I
but
guess.
for Lukacs and in a certain Marxist tradition, especially the Hegelian Marxist tradition, Kant is the highest representative of bourgeois thought. By far. Yep, he is the highest stage of bourgeois thinking. You know, I mean, we're not reading the whole essay, but maybe some of you have read it on the antinomies. That's the Kantian concept, right? That a proof exists on both sides. You know how you say both sides now or whatever. You know,
Both sides were at fault.
Yes, right. Both sides were at fault. Exactly. So these antinomies that play out. So yes, Kant becomes, you know, again, the thinker of a teleological kingdom of ends, perpetual peace. Kant is the thinker of the League of Nations. He doesn't really think through class and class antagonism. He's not thinking through master-slave dialectic as in Hegel. And he's also not thinking reason as revolutionary. He's thinking reason in terms of the tradition and resolving the old empirical, sensible world, right?
Right.
And sense perception, you know, right? And the intelligible, and keeping that dualism alive. At the same time, trying to get a unity of our thinking through what he calls the I think that accompanies all representations.
That's the
So this
transcendental
becomes-
subject.
Yeah, the transcendental subject is the one that does. Levi-Strauss, for example, is his anthropology, structuralism, is transcendentalism without a subject. Right? When Althusser says history is a process without a subject, that's another one. So you have the structuralism of anthropology of Levi-Strauss, you know, it's transcendentalism without a subject, and in Althusser, history is a process, emphasis on process, and in French, as most of you probably know, process is a trial. It's a real deep trial, a trial without a subject. Yep. For Lukacs, there is a subject of history. The proletariat. That is the subject. That's why he's writing this. You know, it's about the proletariat as exterminating. I mean, I wrote this exterminating. I'm playing on Buñuel. Exterminating angel of capital. Yeah, is the proletariat, the agent of history. The question today, and we're going to raise this. Bruno Gulli and I are working on something about, you know, is there an alternative question mark, and is there an agent at this point? Where is the agent? You know, other than the same old suspects reproducing this, the reduplication that's going on in history, right? In many ways. You see, the interesting thing, at least to me, Frankfurt School, one of the reasons Adorno writes the way he does, it dawned on me, I was reading about Thelonious Monk and Mary Lou Williams the other day. And Mary Lou Williams, a great pianist, woman pianist. And Thelonious Monk used to tell Mary Lou, she'd say, how come you make things so difficult? He says, I don't want the downtown people to understand us at all. So Adorno probably wrote this way, so, you know, it cannot be co-opted. This is what Monk was really saying. To the people down at the Cafe Society in Greenwich Village, you know, before they start coming up to Mittens and say they understand, they're going to be totally confused by his compositions. And this is what he told Mary Lou Williams when she asked him, how come this is so difficult to play, etc. Yeah. So it's interesting, you know, that they wrote this way not to be co-opted, you know, and I mean, you know, thought is tough. I mean, it's really tough, yeah, torturous.
The emphasis on the organic makes me, is it okay if I say this? When I studied Capital Volume 1 with David Harvey, I studied almost the whole. I asked him, I said, which philosophy, in your humble estimation, most corresponds to Marx's thinking? And he said, he didn't use the word organicism, he said the philosophy of Whitehead. And I know he never seems to come up as if he were some kind of old bourgeois fogey, but I tried to read Process and Reality. I only read about 1/6 of it, but I hope before I kick the bucket to get
Get the other 5, 6.
Or
Yeah,
get into it a little
87%. Al.
But
I'm going to call you Mr. 87%.
I think David Harvey's estimation should have some weight.
Right.
It is quite. I mean, it's all organic. That's what he calls his philosophy, the philosophy of organism, or organicism. I think is the philosophic way of.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the relationship there. I mean, yeah.
I think Stanley agrees to some extent.
He likes Whitehead very
Yeah.
much, yeah. And I mean, I think the book to be written by philosophers of the next generation would be the combination of Deleuze and Whitehead. I think they have a tremendous amount in common and be very interesting to make some kind of, comparative study there. And I think very few people, some people have hinted at it, but nobody's really produced a major work. But the organic here for Lukacs is really demystifying, destroying in the positive sense. The German word destruction is a positive term, right? You're dismantling to make way, for the new. You're not Anyway, he's trying to deal with this in the sense of moving this forward.
Decompose in order to recompose.
Something like that, and if you want to use biological, metaphors and or more organic metaphors, yeah, sure. So anyway, let's go back. So the totality again, very very important. The knowledge, right, of the real objective, page 14, of the real objective nature of a phenomena, the knowledge of its historical character, right, and the knowledge of its actual function in the totality of society form therefore a single, undivided act of cognition. This unity is shattered by the pseudo-scientific method. Thus, only through the dialectical method could the distinction between constant and variable capital, used in Marx, Volume 1, crucial to economics, be understood. Right? Classical economics was unable to go beyond the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. This was not accidental, for variable capital is only a particular historical manifestation of the fund for providing the necessities of life, or the labor fund which the laborer requires for the maintenance of himself and his family, socially necessary labor time, and with which, whatever be the system of social production, he must himself produce and reproduce. If the labor fund constantly flows to him in the form of money that pays for his labor, it is because the product is created moves constantly away from him in the form of capital. The transaction is veiled by the fact, right? And here's a very good example. He uses Marx as example, is the fact that the product appears as a commodity and the commodity as money. Right here, he's showing this relationship of the totality at work and how the dialectical method, when it takes into account the dialectical conception of totality, can really help us understand this commodification of the world and all its processes. So the fetishistic illusions enveloping all phenomena in capitalist society succeed in concealing reality, but more is concealed than the historical, that is, the transitory, ephemeral nature of phenomena. This concealment is made possible by the fact that in capitalist society, man's environment, and especially the categories of economics, appear to him immediately and necessarily in forms of objectivity, which conceal the fact that they are the categories of the relations of men with each other. Instead, they appear things and the relationship of things with another. Again, the romantic anti-capitalism of Georg Lukacs. The world is an agglomeration of commodities. That's what we see. We are commodified. We are commodified as labor, power, never as human beings. This is a humanist reading, but a very powerful humanist reading, yes. Yeah.
Say that again.
Yeah.
We are commodified as labor, power, never. Not
And
as
never
human beings.
as personal entities or never as
Oh,
human
you mean
beings.
not commodified as personal entities,
Yes.
but not treated as personal.
Yes,
Okay.
not treated as
Okay.
person. Completely commodified as person, right? Yeah. Therefore, when the dialectical model or method, destroys the fiction of the immortality of the categories, and the immortality of the categories is a direct reference to Kant, the table of categories that are created. It also destroys their reified character and clears the way to a knowledge of reality. According to Engels, in his discussion of Marx's critique of political economy, economics does not treat of things, and this is interesting, but of the relations between persons and in the last analysis between classes. However, these relations are always bound to things, and they appear as things. Right? So if you just watch, you remember the old kind of misnomer of the welfare Cadillac, that someone has a Cadillac. If you only see the Cadillac, you think the person really has money, right? And they come from a different class, etc. But you're not understanding the real relations around that. There may be 15 children, on the welfare rolls that allow them to purchase the Cadillac. What are the real relations that are going on there? As well as, other things too. Is really Donald Trump that wealthy? You take away all the bank loans. Is Trump in some ways basically a debtor machine? A debtor machine. That he's ultimately a debtor machine. There's no success there at all in terms of real economic success.
But
Yeah.
that's
He's
exactly
carried by
what-
the banks, and he's a perfect model poster child for debtor neoliberal economies. Yeah, please, go ahead.
I was going
Yeah.
to say that
Yeah.
because that's exactly what private equity is,
Yes.
which is taking over the economy, including public services, and
Right.
it's just living off of debt and then
Yeah.
selling the empty skeleton
Right.
after
Which
you
is what
fire
the
everyone.
Russians did, which is what they did in Russia. The oligarchs took, they enriched themselves by taking, you know what I'm trying to say, I think.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
That's why he's so comfortable with Putin and the other oligarchs.
Well,
I would dispute
Yeah.
that.
You mean Trump is comfortable with the oligarchs?
I think it's an understatement
Yeah, I don't know.
of the millennium.
I think they're going to get Kushner in this go around, but anyway, I hope so. I can't stand an 18-year-old that starts a slumlord at 18 years old. I can understand maybe at 40 or 50 when you really agree stuff, but at 18 years old,
You
as
have
a rich kid, I have standards. That's right.
Boy, talk about limited aspirations.
Yes, indeed. Right. Slumlords at 50. Right. All right. So let's. So anyway, so he makes the distinctions. I think this is a very good section, 10 to 15. It gives you in a nutshell, really, in a very condensed form, Lukacs' notion of the dialectical method vis-a-vis the totality. So I recommend reading. I'm sorry I didn't put it out. I know I mentioned it in the note I sent out, but I should have mentioned it last week, okay? And, all of this whole chapter, I know it's been read in Stanley's class. We did one of this about a year and a half ago or a year ago in a class, and this is a very significant essay if you want to know more about Lukacs, what is Orthodox Marxism, how he confronts internally the tradition of the Plekhanovs, the Max Adlers, the Edward Bernsteins, all the figures who position themselves as leading Marxist lights, right? Yeah, etc. Okay, so let's just turn to the phenomena of reification. I want to emphasize a couple of things, and then we'll go on to the very sophisticated. Korsch to me is a plot summarizer, but it's a good plot summary about what Marxism and philosophy was about. We'll go over that generally speaking, and then we'll go on to the Adorno. So anyway, I think last week I was reading sections of this. The problem of reification is it grows out of the fetishistic character of commodities. That goes without saying on page 83, 84, and this metaphor of the phantom objectivity, etc. Right? Okay? And then, of course, Lukacs talks about the commodity structure that penetrates every form of everyday life. Stuff we know, right, but need to be reminded of. How are things commodified? And again, the real relations between the things. Right? Okay? He goes through a kind of a historical moment on 85 from mercantile capitalism at the bottom of the page. But then I think the beginning of the crucial part of this phenomena of reification. On page 86, the commodity can only be understood in its undistorted essence when it becomes the universal category of society as a whole. It is only in this moment does the reification produced by commodity relations assume decisive importance both for the objective evolution of society and for the stance adopted by men towards it. Only then does the commodity become crucial for the subjugation of men's consciousness to the forms in which this reification finds expression, and for their attempts to comprehend the process or to rebel against its disastrous effects and liberate themselves from servitude to the second nature so created. Okay? Very, very important. Marx describes the basic phenomena of reification as follows. This is essential, page 86. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves but between the products of their labor. This is the reason why the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. It is only a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of relation between things. How many times we go into the supermarket, we only see things. We don't study who's buying what, unless you're a psychologist getting paid to study this, or etc. Very few people do that. Go to the fairway with Peter Bratsis sometimes. You'll get an exercise in the fetishism of the commodities and the commodity forms, right? It would work, right? I mean, he understands what he's doing, but it is an example of how the relation between things, etc. How are things categorized? How do they appeal, etc. One example among many others. Look at the building of downtown Brooklyn. I don't know if you've been to the Atlantic Terminal recently, but you walk out to the Apple store, then to Whole Foods, right? And then to BAM, right? It used to just be BAM, which was fine with me, wonderful. But now, all these added.
What is BAM?
Brooklyn Academy of Music.
Oh.
Yeah, the theater and music hall and cinema and all this, right? Yeah, so anyway. So what is the central importance here is because of this situation, a man's activity, his own labor, becomes something objective and independent of him. And Lukacs is obviously describing labor power here, right? Something that controls him by virtue of an autonomy that is alien to man, right? And this is what reification does. Reification makes you consider yourself only labor power. You are selling to the marketplace labor power. Now you say you sell yourself, you promote yourself. All these kind of things are encapsulated in this right here, what he's talking about vis-a-vis the system. It's an autonomy that you've given up and that is completely alien to you, and the autonomy lies in the objective conditions under which you're employed and under which the capitalist relations have produced for you. That's it. Yeah. Right? And then he goes on, objectively, a world of objects, and this is interesting. This is very Hegelian move here by Lukacs. Objectively, a world of objects and relation between things springs into being, the world of commodities and their movements on the market. The laws governing those objects, or these objects, are indeed gradually discovered by men, but even so, they confront him as invisible forces, reified forces that generate their own power. Part of the unknowable realm, that are generating their own power. The individual can use his knowledge of these laws to his own advantage, but he is not able to modify the process by his own activity. Then subjectively, so that's objectively, subjectively, when the market economy has been fully developed, a man's activity becomes estranged from himself. Echoes of the Marx of the Paris manuscripts, estranged labor, and how well he describes that, right? Etc. It turns into a commodity which, subject to the human objectivity of the natural laws of society must go its own way independently of man, just like any consumer article. You're commodified, you become just like a disposable, article, right? In a way, right? Completely. So, I mean, this is not anything, again, that's, so foreign to our ears or so, startling, but it's good to be reminded, and how do these relations really take place? Because I doubt most of us think in terms of everyday life that we're thinking the totality of production, consumption, distribution, and exchange.
Yeah.
Very few things, are going on. Very few people thinking this through. Wanted to say? Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I love kiwi, but I won't buy kiwi. I know where it's coming from. It's refrigerated cross country. I'm going to get sick. I buy my kiwi and I buy organic kiwi at the John Talon market in Montreal. So I restrict my kiwi eating to Montreal. Because I always see it's where it's coming from, and et cetera. But I mean, this is another thing that we're living through, in a sense. Yeah, it's based on an enormous reification, enormous, that you have kiwi from Chile that goes to the West Coast and then it's trucked cross country to New York City. Yeah. What are we doing, in a sense? And then, of course, it's an arm and a leg to go to the farmer's market, right? And that's not guaranteed to make you healthy either. So, so.
You should join the new homesteading movement. I think it's Laura Elliott. Check
She's
her
doing the
out.
homestead. Okay.
She's the
Good.
she-
Okay.
Yeah,
So
with a huge income.
right. So Marx will go on. What is characteristic, and Lukacs quotes Marx, is that in the eyes of the laborer himself, in the eyes of our daily labor power assumes the form of a commodity belonging to him. On the other hand, it is only at this moment that the commodity form of the products of labor becomes general. This is really the phenomena of the experience of the reified consciousness. Right here. He's encapsulating this through Marx. This is what the laborer actually does. He sees the eyes and the form of the commodity belonging to him. You buy it, you take it, etc. But it is only the commodity form of the products of labor become generalized, right? No longer specific, who produced it, what labor went into it, etc., what processes of estrangement, what processes of alienation, etc., etc. Yeah. Thus, the universality of the commodity form is responsible both objectively and subjectively for the abstraction of the human labor incorporated in commodities. This universality becomes historically possible because the process of abstraction has become completed. So listen, one way of reading always in terms of this system is to look at the levels of abstraction involved. What are the levels of abstraction? The method, if you will, of dialectics is always thinking from abstraction, this chalk, this thing, the abstract to the concrete. We do not begin with the concrete. We always begin with levels of abstraction. That's how we move in dialectical processes. This table's a complete abstraction to Marx until you go through the levels of how ultimately it was produced. Not only its materiality, but the actual production process, et cetera, how did it get here, and what kind of relations is it involved in. The great book on this, if you're interested in dialectical method, is Karl Kosik, Eastern European Czech philosopher, The Dialectics of the Concrete. A brilliant chapter on the movement from abstract to concrete. His name is Kosik. Karl Kosik. Written in the 1960s. $110 used copy on Amazon. But I have a photocopy if anybody's really interested that we can reproduce. For reified relations of a Xerox invention many years ago. Right? So anyway, all right. So, subjectively is abstract in only the common factor to which the various commodities are reduced. It is also becomes the real principle governing the actual production of commodities. Okay? So again, the movement from the abstract to the concrete and reading through always the levels of abstraction, right? Okay, then Lukacs goes on, and I think this was a very interesting part of this essay. Some of you that we did Heidegger, will understand this even deeper, I think, with the rationalization and the calculation. He speaks about the principle of rationalization based on what is and can be calculated. This is page 88. Calculative rationality. A nicer, fancier way of calling capitalism what it is. Calculated rationality, right? And rationalization. Yep, calculated rationality. The chief changes are undergone by the subject and object of the economic process are as follows. In the first place, the mathematical analysis of work processes denotes a break with the organic, the irrational, and qualitative determinate unity of the product. Rationalization in the sense of being able to predict with even greater precision all the results to be achieved is only to be acquired by the exact breakdown of every complex into its elements and by the study of the special laws that govern production. This is actually a description of Taylorization, of Frederick Taylor's, stuff that Lenin admired tremendously, by the way, Taylorization, And one of the problems in the Soviet Union was productivism, to my mind. The culture did not, it went the way of productivism instead of the way of privileging culture at every moment in this. In some way. I know that. No, I'm aware of that.
They were just wildly
No. Yes.
doing their best.
Yes, doing their best, Al. I agree.
However inadequate, however deficient.
Yeah,
and
I
inadequate.
understand. Yeah, all right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the problem is we don't have these discussions anymore, but what about state capitalism?
Yeah.
Right? That's really the issue here.
Yeah, that's what
State
Wolf
capitalism.
always says that.
Yeah.
Was his name,
Rick Wolf?
Yeah.
He uses state capitalism?
Yeah.
Good. That's good.
which is what it is. But,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought they were only
They had
using,
no precedence.
they were using
they-
sugar babies, huh?
They
That's
they
the
had no
latest,
tradition going back to Magna Carta the way we do.
I see. Okay. All right. So let's look at this again. So rationalization, in the sense of being able to predict with even greater precision all the results and the exact breakdown of every complex into its element and by the study of special laws governing production. Accordingly, it must declare war on the organic manufacture, right? And this is the attack upon artisanal production and organic, right? Manufacture of whole products based on the traditional amalgamation of empirical experiences of work. Rationalization is unthinkable without specialization. Specialization is required for the capitalist mode of production. And of course, the division of labor
Division of
into
labor.
little special. Yeah. But first of all, specialization. Very, very important. That leads to the division of labor. The finished article ceases to be the object of the work process. The latter turns into the objective synthesis. This is interesting, objective synthesis of rationalized special systems whose unity is determined by pure calculation and which therefore seem to be arbitrarily connected with each other. This destroys the organic necessity with which interrelated special operations are unified in the end product. The unity of a product as a commodity no longer coincides with its unity as a use value. As society becomes more radically capitalistic, the increasing technical autonomy of the special operations involved in production is expressed also as an economic autonomy, as the growing relativization of the commodity character of a product at the various stages of production. It is thus possible to separate forcibly the production of a use value in time and space. This goes hand in hand with the union in time and space of special operations that are related to a heterogeneous use values. In the second place, the fragmentation of the object is not only the calculation and the calculated rationality, it's the fragmentation of the object of production necessarily entails the fragmentation of its subject, right? This is very important, fragmentation. And as most of you know, as students of literature, we get April is the cruelest month, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, shoring up the fragments, right? We begin to see fragment as a literary form, Kafka and others, these kind of writing things, or who Lukacs could not stand to read. Until after, this is interesting, after living in Moscow during the 30s, he said, kind of tongue-in-cheek, well, it seems like Kafka was a realist. The bureaucracy, anyway. All right. So, in consequence of the rationalization of the work process, the human qualities and idiosyncrasies of the worker appear increasingly as mere sources of error. You fucked up. Right, etc. When contrasted with these abstract special laws functioning according to rational predictions. Neither objectively nor in their relation to his work does man appear as the authentic master of the process. On the contrary, he is a mechanical part. Yeah? No longer any kind of... Yeah, please.
We have to put labels, like hang tags on the clothes and explain to the consumer that the irregularity is a good thing. Like seeing the hand is a good thing, and so that the stores won't return them to us and ask for the money back.
There you go. That's a perfect example from the textile industry that work here.
The flaws are part of the natural beauty of the product. Is that
Yeah, we have to explain it, that whole thing.
Yeah. Urban
Like-
Outfitters has a new little section now, and it's items that are purchased from garage sales, going for $50 and up, and there's a little tag just like that. The flaws in this lovely wool, whatever, should be seen as evidence of its antique.
Right.
That's a little different.
That's,
quality.
I'm talking about like the hand,
The clothes are made by
that the
hand.
clothes are made by hand.
Or just made.
We
in
should
general.
And that
respect
we
their
should-
flaws as
that they're not flaws. That
No,
they're
it's
just
not
what it
flaws.
is.
They were
No.
done on
Because
purpose.
It's
the
the
machine-
Like cutting the blue
idiosyncrasies
jeans at the knee.
of the worker.
Done on purpose.
give it the value, and it's not a reason
Right,
to
right.
disvalue it.
Rachel had a scissors, working there, right? And therefore, it's, more valuable.
So it's
Right,
not a
but
flaw.
I-
It's redefined as a.
Well, it's,
But this
but
is-
it's never was
But
a
it
flaw.
never was a flaw, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
Is that capital is attacking the savoir-faire, as he explicitly says on page 88,
right. Good
and it's
point.
so far gone now that we have to explain to people, because they're so alienated from their labor, that we have to explain to people this is not why we're doing it. It's more for the money, but the fact that we have to explain it to people is insanity.
But that little addition that you made, I think, is really interesting, because when you talked about people don't know where this stuff comes from, well, I mean, that's the butt of a big, Portlandia thing, where I want to know where my fucking organic chicken comes from. Where was it
funny one.
free-ranging? And
What was its name?
Who was the
What was
rooster?
the name?
Where did it go on vacation?
and for you,
Yeah,
what should be the case
Slavery.
has become an opportunity
of course.
to increase the surplus value
Exactly.
of something. So I mean, this is
It's twisted.
this is dynamic capitalism.
Yes,
Yeah.
of
You
course.
haven't changed anything qualitatively.
No.
There's no qualitative change
Right.
in terms of the model that sells that clothing, except they are playing on a qualitative change that everyone thinks we want. We want a handmade garment. We want to know where the chicken went on vacation. You know, but none of it actually changes
not at
the
all.
production, the
Not at all.
nothing changes.
No.
What about organic food? It's supposed to be so intrinsically superior to non-organic.
Yeah, well, it is. Unless you like to eat pesticides.
What does organic literally means pesticide-free, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the working
I
definition.
think there's some level
On
of
organic
pesticide
now,
that's
I mean,
allowed, though.
French,
Because
they
it's
call
going to be in the
biologique.
next field.
Biologique,
One
yeah,
field
oui.
has the
Oui.
organic raspberries, the other
And the
field
one
doesn't,
I
and
can
there's
tell you
something
this.
called wind, and it kind of universalizes everything.
Right.
My county.
Interesting.
It's still a good idea to buy organic, I
Okay.
think, though, because you're
But
you're
it might be a
basically
label.
saying that you don't
It
want
might
shit.
merely be a label. You never. How can you be
Sure.
sure?
Make sure you
You
read all the
cannot-
labels.
You can't be sure.
There's
You
enough.
cannot.
There are enough of them now.
Okay. Let me just go on real quickly here. I'm sorry. Yeah. Anyway, a laborer is progressively rationalized and mechanized. His lack of will, and this is interesting because this is where the passivity and where we have problems, in terms of real insurrection, right? His lack of will is reinforced by the way in which his activity becomes less and less active and more contemplative. And this is what, now all the machines are doing. No longer is the worker engaged in actual physical processes so much, or muscular process. It's finger and, looking at designs and stuff like this. It's a very different kind of moment here with technology in terms of the body and its relationship to production. So this is very important to keep in mind for today. Yeah. Anyway, the contemplative stance adopted towards a process mechanically conforming to fixed laws and enacted independently of man's consciousness. The machine will show me how we have to construct this site on Ashland Place and Fulton Avenue in Brooklyn. I don't have to use my head at all. I don't have to use any thinking, etc. The blueprint is here, etc. Yeah, impervious to human intervention, i.e. a perfectly closed system, must likewise transform the basic categories of man's immediate attitude to the world. This is important too. The cultural aspect, the body, the subject position of the body, right? It reduces space and time to a common denominator and degrades time to the dimension of space. Very smart here. Yeah,
So,
go ahead. Yeah,
so
please.
is there an alternative? No, because basically we're all conditioned by these, by space and time. Essentially, this is sort of position in some ways.
You mean the reduction of having
Yeah.
time
Like we can't
reduced to
even-
space in
yeah,
capitalism?
yeah.
Well, I mean, the question is yes, how do we rethink time? I mean,
Right.
this is why people like Heidegger and Hegel and other thinkers of time, why Stiegler, subtitles his book, Technics and Time. It's really about the temporality and then ultimately how do one recapture one's time? Because what capitalism has done, and I'll swear by this, not only is your labor in your alienated labor or estranged labor, of course it depends on the field you're in and what
Yeah,
you're
not
engaged
all
in.
labor is
What
alienated.
what it does, yes, what it does ultimately is it steals time.
Yeah.
That's what it's done, and it's reduced all time to space. Right? This is really the problem. You have had this collapse into space. So the thinking of time is really a radical move. I mean, in a way, it's a very radical move. I think, one reason that, people did go back and read Heidegger despite the affiliations, why they did read Hans Reichenbach, why they did, why Stiegler has, achieved a certain kind of audience, the rethinking of time, etc. And Tony Negre, we're going to read Time and Revolution at the end of this. I think it's a good place to end because he at least tries to think the temporal dimension of revolution. Right? What that would mean in propositional form. Now, this is the Negre before Empire, Multitude, Commonwealth, and for the Fourth Assembly, the 4 volumes with Michael Hart. This is a Negre of 2000, before the success of Empire, which was a bestseller. But we're going to look at this time for revolution and what would this really mean, in terms of the temporal dimension. How's it? We always talk about time-saving devices. We're always checking to move on, everyday time, on clock time,
Right.
etc. We're not thinking how this time and space relationship has been condensed and reduced to just spatial relations. It's a geography of capital.
Right.
It's a geometry of capital. It's no longer a temporality in some ways. We talk about the working day, yes and yes, but really it's the compression, if you will, into space that is going on all the time. And I think Lukacs is sort of on this, the dimension of space. And then he cites Marx, and this is good. Through the subordination of man to the machine, Marx is anticipating a lot of this. The situation arises in which men are effaced by their labor, in which the pendulum of the clock has become an accurate measure of the relative activity of two workers as it is of the speed of two locomotives. Right? Therefore, we should not say that one man's hour is worth another man's hour, but rather that one man during an hour is worth just as much as another man during an hour. Time is everything, man is nothing. He is at most the incarnation of time. Quality no longer matters. Quantity alone decides everything, hour for hour, day for day. And that's Marx. Thus time sheds its qualitative, its variable, flowing nature. In one full swoop, you have Hegel, you have Heidegger, Einstein, and Bergson in one sentence here, in some way, right? It freezes into an exactly delimited, quantifiable continuum filled with quantifiable things, the reified, mechanically objectified performance of the worker, wholly separated from his total human personality. Of course, this destroys the personality. This is another reason why the dream of the whole man should always be out there as part of the good life, to my opinion. The dream of the whole person. That's what communism, in a sense, is really promising in the future, right? The dream of the whole person.
Marx used a very, very strong metaphor in the Paris documents. He called the end products for some workers, you become a crippled monstrosity.
Yes,
it's a
Frankenstein in the movies. Not Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, but Frankenstein in the RKO.
It's an excellent metaphor.
Yeah.
It might be overly strong, but it does make some people, some workers, into a crippled monstrosity.
You know that Frankenstein, 1932, the presentation of Boris Karloff as the monster was really an attempt to get people turned off to the worker culture and to the proletarian culture in the middle of the third year of the Depression. But the character, Frankenstein's monster, is a very sympathetic character when you read Mary Shelley. Very sympathetic. Learns how to read, tries to make friends, right? Tries to even reason with his maker.
He also says, "You created me, but you're not my master."
Yes, he did say that. Yes. Yeah. So, it's interesting how this works, again, on the ideological level as well. So anyway, the reified, mechanically objectified performance wholly separated from his total human personality. So reification, once again, produces this crippled, monstrosity
is the word.
if you will. Yeah. Very interesting, right? Etc. Fragmented, specialized production of the object of labor. The subject's labor must likewise be rationally fragmented, right? Going towards the division of labor, right? But even worse than just a division of labor, knowing your place in the chain of command of production, but even being fragmented in that, completely. No satisfaction taken in. Part of what, we can't make love, 10 hours a day. Maybe some people, but anyway, the thing is we have to work or we have to have some forms of sublimation. That's still at this point, right? We have to figure this out, right? Okay? So anyway, to go down, on the other hand, the personality can do no more than look on helplessly while its own existence is reduced to an isolated particle and fed into an alien system. Right? He's good. He's a very good writer. I haven't read this obviously in the original, but the translation is good. On the other hand, the mechanical disintegration of the process of production into its components also destroys those bonds that had bounded individuals to a community in the days when production was still organic. there still was some kind of bonding going on between the
Even
workers.
in the Middle
You
Ages.
weren't bonded through your sports team. You know, did you watch the Giants last weekend? Did you see that win? Did you see the basketball game? You know, this is the new form of bonding. It's never really the human bonding so much in the workplace now. It's kind of an external referent that makes the bonding that people come together. You know, I'm not saying always, but you know, this seems to be a new kind of code that goes on in the workplace. Yeah, etc. Right. In this respect, mechanization makes of them isolated, abstract atoms whose work no longer brings them together, and organically it becomes mediated. And in a way, this is a reading of the economic and philosophical manuscripts.
Right.
It becomes mediated to an increasing extent exclusively by the abstract laws of the mechanism which imprisons them, which imprisons them, right? Right? So the mediation is an imprisonment, in terms of everyday work practices, etc. And then he goes through the internal organization. We won't go through that. The factory. Okay. The principle of rational, page 91, and calculability must embrace every aspect of life in capitalism. Every aspect of life. You must think about that. Consumer articles no longer appear. This is the third paragraph on page 91. Consumer articles no longer appear as the products of an organic process within a community. They now appear on the one hand as an abstract members of a species identical by definition with other members. Oh, you bought that too? You have one of those iPhones, etc. And on the other hand, as isolated objects, the possession or non-possession of which depends on rational calculations. Only when the whole life of society is thus fragmented into the isolated acts of commodity exchange can the free worker come into being at the same time as fate becomes the typical fate of the whole society. Okay? So anyway, it's only apparent, this fragmentation. He goes a little deeper here, again, trying to discover behind this atomization, even though it's an illusion, it is a necessary illusion in terms of our society. And this is what positivism leads to, is the ongoing atomization of everyday life and of individuals. This has always been an antagonism of dialectical thinking, is atomization and everyday atomization. Vertical building, New York City, nothing but atomization. You see it. We're living in this atomized subject. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Could you make clear the connection between positivism and atomization? I understand those both separately, but not the
Well,
connection.
I mean, what positivism leads to, in terms of its factual basis, is a kind of almost atomization of individuals.
Like an accumulation
Yes,
of facts
accumulation
or
of
an accumulation
facts.
of separate individuals being
Exactly.
the same thing.
And statistics being part of that. I'm watching people, I'm part of this sustainability project at LIU. I'm teaching a course on environmental philosophy, so I have to go to these stupid meetings. I look at the biologists, they come in with population dynamics. This is positivism at work. This is the way the population is acting in this region or something like that. This is the worst of things. And then you become atomized very much. There's no individuals. There's nothing about the community, how it's been shaped, anything about that. It's just almost a purely statistical approach, right? On a good day, statistical, with sometimes fancy language.
Coming
Yeah.
from medicine, it's
Yeah.
the same. If it can't be measured, it does not exist.
That's right. That's right.
If there's no biological substrate for it, it does not exist.
You could see Freud doing neuroses, huh? Number 1 neuroses, number 2, number 3, degrees of neuroses, right? I don't think so. But anyway, this is part of the problem, of the anti-dialectical nature of our educational system. Because from day one, we're bombarded with statistics, facts, thinking in terms
Information,
of,
not
information, overloaded information, etc. There's never any kind of, dialectical, on the one hand this, on the other hand this. What are the contradictions involved here? Very, very few people. I see it in the students. They have no analogical ability. And I'm not talking only about kids who are going to bad public schools. I'm talking about kids who come from Berkeley, Carroll, some of your better schools in the city of New York. Yeah.
You said analogical, right?
They don't.
That's
They're
good,
unable
yeah.
to think.
They
Yeah,
can analyze, maybe.
They can analyze a
but they
little bit, but
can't
not really.
analogize.
No, there's a
That's
very
good
few.
word
Yeah.
to
Every other
remember.
word is like. They don't know what they're saying.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like this, man. Like that. Like.
Right.
You know,
They
it's like
sound
this.
like goofs, frankly. I don't want to.
Like Google. Like Gaga. Google and Gaga.
Yeah, Lady Gaga.
Yeah, Lady Gaga. Or she was about as she's laughing all the way to the bank at least.
Yeah, right.
It's like
Right. Anyway,
Clueless or something.
yeah, good Italian Brooklyn person, huh? Yeah. Anyway, all right. So let's just go on to the specialization. So I suggest, and I know in the class that we were doing that it's kind of on hold right now. Philosophy of money. He has a section here on page 95. Real capitalist foundation and make them independent and permanent, regarding this as a timeless model of human relations in general. This can be seen most clearly in Zemmel's book, The Philosophy of Money, where we kind of left off. A very interesting and perceptive work in matters of detail. They offer no more than a description, and this is one of Marx's great, beautiful passages, the enchanted, perverted, topsy-turvy world in which Monsieur Le Capital and Madame La Terre do their ghost walking as social characters and at the same time as mere things. This is Marx, but they do not go further than a description, and their deepening of the problem runs in circles around the eternal manifestations of reification. So he's basically talking about the failure of political economy to address this, right? And the failure of philosophy to address these kind of reified characteristics of everyday life. Okay, so let me just go to the specialization, page 103. The specialization of skills leads to the destruction of every image of the whole, section 3. And as, despite this, the need to grasp the whole, at least cognitively, cannot die out, we find that science, which is likewise based on specialization and thus caught up in the same immediacy, and this, by the way, is a premise of Stanley's book, Science is Power, if you ever get the chance to read it. It's a little too academic for my taste, the language, but it is a good book about the social relation, science is power. And the social relations embedded in the scientific project, is criticized for having torn the real world into shreds and having lost its vision of the whole. In reply to allegations that the various factors are not treated as whole, Marx retorts that this criticism is leveled as though it were the textbooks that impress the separation upon life and not life upon the textbooks. Interesting, science and social relations, right? And one of the great books about science and socialization is A Forgotten Person, English Marxist, J.D. Bernal, Martin Bernal's father, metallurgist, English Marxist, part of the Jane Harrison School, Science as Social Action. He believed in the vanguard of scientists, that there should be a scientific aristocracy that would lead the world out of its morass. He actually believed this, that there should be created a new aristocracy of scientists that would lead the vanguard out. J.D. Bernal, yeah. Martin Bernal, as you know, Black Athena, is his son. Yeah.
Is he a social scientist or a philosopher?
No, it's a scientist.
Oh.
Yeah, he was a scientist himself, biologist, and I think he also had training in physics. But he wrote about science and social action. Very, very brilliant work. Yeah, in a sense. And you can see some of this, playing out in his work of the Lukacs. Anyway, let me just finish with this. The various factors not treated as retorts, even though this criticism deserves refutation in its naive form, it becomes comprehensible when we look from a moment from the outside, from a vantage point other than that of reified consciousness. At the activity of modern science, which is both sociologically and methodologically necessary and for that reason comprehensible. Such a look will reveal, without constituting a criticism, that the more intricate a modern science becomes, And the better it understands itself methodologically, the more resolutely it will turn its back on the ontological problems of its own sphere of influence and eliminate them from the realm from which it had achieved some insight. Very, very good. This is very much Heidegger, too, in Being and Time, in terms of the fundamental, foundational ontology. You know, how the sciences have become specialized, they've lost their ontological grounding, we've forgotten about this. It's very, very important, you know, in terms of how the disciplines are founded, you know.
Yeah,
and
Stanley
the
Fish, that's
overspecialization.
Stanley Fish's essay, 1989, Being Interdisciplinary is Hard to Do. He talks about the reification of the disciplines, how they get a body of knowledge and then they begin to seal off. I think it's the same thing we're talking about.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, I'm a big fan of Stanley Fish's,
Oh.
but it's okay. I mean, I had a class with him. We used to say he wrote a book called "Is There a Text in This Class?" You know, during the Derridian moment, and during that time we used to go to class. Is there a fish in this class? Yeah. So anyway, so it's a kind of a joke in some ways. Very bright man, very good on the Constitution,
Fish, yeah.
very smart, but certainly not a leftist. But yes, he's right about the specialization.
Well, I can send you
of
the passage
disciplines.
or
Yeah. No, I know his
something.
work. Yeah, he's also cheats at basketball.
Oh, he does?
A lot of elbows and stuff like that. So I remember very well. I played.
Bush was a specialist.
Yeah. Played guard, but a lot of elbows, you know, going in. I didn't follow you. You know. There you go. Yeah. Anyway, so all right. So you know. The more highly developed and more scientific, the more it will become a formal, closed system of partial laws. Again, the lack of the totality. Partial laws, again, playing out here.
Fragmentation.
Right? It will then find that the world lying beyond its confines, and in particular, the material base which it is its task to understand, its own concrete underlying reality lies methodologically and in principle beyond its grasp. Okay? Marx acutely summed this up in the situation with reference to economics when he declared use value as such lies outside the sphere of investigation of political economy. We forget about use value of anything in science, etc. We're always looking at the exchange value in political economy. We've forgotten, you know, what that use value really is. It would be a mistake to suppose that certain analytical devices, such as we find in the theory of marginal utility, might show the way out of this impasse. It is possible to set aside objective laws governing the production and movement of commodities, which regulate the market, and subjective modes of behavior on it, and to make the attempt to start from subjective behavior on the market. But this simply shifts, and this is marketing strategy. He's describing what they do on Madison Avenue every day of the week, what the psychologists are trained to do. This is a perfect description of that. But for Lukacs, this simply shifts the question from the main issue to more and more derivative and reified stages without negating the formalism of the method and the elimination from the outside of the concrete material underlying it. The formal act of exchange, which constitutes the basic fact for the theory of marginal utility, likewise suppresses use value as use value and establishes a relation of concrete equality between concretely unequal and indeed incomparable objects. It is this that creates this impasse. Right? Thus, the subject of the exchange is just as abstract, formal, and reified as its object, the consumer. Right? The looking at the marketing. The limits of this abstract and formal method are revealed in the fact that its chosen goal is an abstract system of laws that focuses on the theory of marginal utility just as much as classical economics. But the formal abstraction of these laws transforms economics into a closed, partial system, and this in turn is unable to penetrate its own material substratum, nor can it advance from there to an understanding of society in its entirety, and so it is compelled to view that substratum as unchangeable, immutable, eternal datum. Right? Immutable, eternal datum. Science is thereby debarred from comprehending the development and the demise, the social character of its own material base, no less than the range of possible attitudes towards it and the nature of its own formal system. So science, to use a phrase of Heidegger's, science does not think. Right here, summed up by Lukacs, you know, about 20-something years before Heidegger said that, which is interesting, you know. In some ways, they all kind of come out of, you know, the Kantian, Hegelian problematic, and, you know, you're talking about a generation that was somewhat on the same page vis-a-vis calculated rationality. You know, I mean, Heidegger was very anti-capitalist, too. You know, he went the other way in terms of trying to find a solution, you know, in a way was probably a very nostalgic and, you know, something that we, you know, have a hard time grasping what
If
he tried to
science
do.
doesn't
But
think, what can we say it does do?
it just
We
does.
know
It
it's
does.
quantified. We
It
know
does.
it's quantified.
It does. It does. It does not think, though.
It does what?
It does. It does not think.
Oh.
It does.
It just
Science
does.
does.
It
It just
just-
does. It does not go through self-critiques or
Reflect. It
through this.
doesn't reflect.
Yeah, well, it has a capacity to reflect, but it does not think, right? It's able to reflect on hypotheses, where an experiment went wrong and these kind of things. But for Heidegger, it does not think. And for Lukacs, as you see here, it is unable to understand, you know, its own formal system and the attitudes that surround it towards it, and it does not understand its own material base as social action, as Bernal
Yeah.
puts out. This is what he's saying.
Yeah.
You know, and Bruno Latour is a good example of this too, you know, in a kind of superficial way. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of the way that consumer research and brand strategy relies on its idea of social science.
Who is this? I'm sorry.
Like consumer research.
Oh, consumer
The way
research.
that
Yeah,
brand
yeah, sure.
strategy and
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
like that comes from
Yeah.
consumer research.
Yeah.
And the way that's approached is there's boxes that you check off, like focus groups and sometimes
Yeah.
ethnographies and stuff like that. And you're never questioning the point of view that you take and why you're doing this in the first place. And what you do is then produce stereotypes based on checking these scientific quote-unquote
Right.
boxes that then are supposed to represent the real world out there back to the real world without ever questioning the construction of those stereotypes and those images that are being
Right,
reflected
right.
back. But it absolutely understands itself as not only a social science, but a process that produces an educational culture because it's learning what the world wants
Right,
and then
right.
showing the world what it doesn't know. that it
How to
doesn't know
produce
in the
and
first place.
reproduce desire.
Absolutely.
Right.
But it truly understands itself, and the subjects who are
Right,
in charge of it
right, right.
are trained to understand themselves as sincerely doing science and sincerely producing education
Right.
as a result of it.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. David.
Yeah, this is making me think of the Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific
Yeah.
Revolution.
Yeah. The paradigm
You know,
shifts. Yeah.
With Perry, yeah, where science does not think, he would say, maybe categorized as normal science, quote unquote,
Right.
which just goes along until enough contradictions build up in the standard model that it can't hold anymore. And
Then it has to shift
There's a
paradigms.
revolution,
Yeah.
a paradigm.
Yeah.
So would he say perhaps at that point, science is thinking, or, you know, at least to that extent that it's realizing its
Well, maybe the
priorities?
force and the limits that the contradictions put makes it have to do something differently. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to think. And you know, Foucault has a kind of an argument with Kuhn of which he sees formations of new knowledge form, epistemes. You know, knowledge formations that aren't really paradigm shifts, that what happens is new discursive practices, you know, start to happen, and a new regularity is set up around science. So Foucault has a little bit of a thing with Kuhn on this. And then Deleuze and Guattari, in another vein, talk about royal science as what we're subjected to since Plato. And they want to go a completely different way. They want to kind of destroy this notion of royal science that has been part of the Western tradition, you know, etc. And they want to go to more, I don't know, indigenous forms of scientific reasoning or lack of reasoning in a sense to set up alternatives in some ways. But I mean, you know, this is a long story in terms of their work. You know,
Instrumentality and pragmatism.
well, this is what he's, you know,
Yeah.
really critiquing,
Yeah,
is instrumental
right.
rationality alongside the calculative. Yeah. Okay, it's time to go, is that what you're telling me?
It's more than 10 minutes past time to
Oh, okay, but we usually go to 4:30, right? Yeah? Yeah, okay, all right, well, I'll tell you what we'll do, I mean, you know, we'll be here next week, and I'll finish this up, just a little bit more on specialization. We'll do Adorno
May I
and
copy-
the
May I
yeah.
copy the?
Yeah, sure. And the Marxism in philosophy, just to highlight this is basically a summary of the relationship of Marx to philosophy by Korsch. And you should, I mean, you can get this in Marxism.org on the archives and print it up from
Korsch.
there. I mean, there's some interesting points here. I mean, again, it's not sophisticated like Lukacs. I mean, Korsch was part of the Council Communist movement. He was kicked out of the party by Lenin. He was a Leninist to begin with. He wrote this the same year as Lukacs wrote History and Class Consciousness. I think it's important because he was one of the first to kind of problematize Marx and philosophy. So, we'll look at this, but, kind of quickly, in a way. I do want to get to the Adorno because I think it's a very important piece that he gave as a radio address in 1962 in Germany
So
upon
sorry,
his
we're
return.
reading Marxism and Philosophy in the course.
Yes,
Okay.
Korsch.
In Korsch.
Korsch is Marxism and
Yeah.
philosophy.
And
And then
we're gonna
Adorno's
get to
Why
the
Still
Why
Philosophy. Yeah, and then is there access to Coletti and Della Volpe, or?
I
is
think
that-
so. I think it's just was a different edition.
Okay, let's see how far we get. I can introduce the Italian school, and then we'll read them for the next week, and then go on to Althusser, and then come back around to Negre. Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. You think they're available? I think
I think so.
Coletti's available. I want you to read. I mean, one thing I'm trying to do is make a move towards we're reading the Hegelian Marxists right now, the Totality, right? With Della Volpe and Coletti, you're going to see more Kantian Marxism at work, which started to play out in the 80s in a very active way, and in the French scene with Jean-François Lyotard and the postmodernist return to Kant. So that's one reason I'm doing this. Althusser is a good bridge since he's so controversial and et cetera, and we can talk about this vis-a-vis science and Marxism as science, right? In a way, will be interesting, and then we'll again, like I said, end with the Negre's Time for Revolution. Yeah.
So
yeah.
are we reading the Italians for next week, or probably
I mean,
not?
if you have time and, they're on the website, yeah, it'd be a good thing to do, but I don't know if I'm gonna have time in the allotted time to get to them in a full way. So we'll probably do maybe partially a little bit of them next week and the following week, right?
What are their
And
names?
that's
I'm
it.
sorry.
Della Volpe, Galvano Della Volpe. We're gonna read from Logic is a Positive Science. Logic is a Positive Science, and the other one would be Marxism and Hegel, Lucio Coletti, the first chapter of that, on the dialectical method too.
Are they
So we're
both
gonna
on
be-
the website, Marxist.org? No.
No, I don't think they're, Coletti may be, I'm not sure, but Josh on our website has a link to the books. right?
We're gonna put one on there. It's not on there yet,
Oh, it's not?
but I
Okay.
can try and find it and put it on there. It was
No,
the
I
only
think,
one.
I think Marxism and Hegel is available in PDF.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I'm pretty sure of that, by Coletti. It's a New Left book.
No, the
and
Della
No,
Volpe.
Coletti is there.
Oh, it's already there,
As a
Della Volpe
hyperlink.
is not there.
It's-
I'll
it's
make a
the,
copy, I'll try to get copies if you can't get it.
The Volpe
I have the
Della
Della
Volpe.
We have the
Volpe.
book.
It's a very serious
good
study
copy.
of many years of research on dialectics and logic. Logic, yeah, very, very serious school in Italy.
But you think probably not on Marxism?
You're gonna finish this next week?
Yeah,
I think I couldn't
finish
find
this,
it.
Adorno, Why Still
then go
Philosophy,
into the-
and then we'll go to the Italian,
The
the
Italian.
Italian schools, yeah. And I have a lot of other things too, but, anyway. And I'll go back to this Kantian thing in terms of the two moments of the critique of pure reason, metaphysics, and epistemology, and what some of the stakes are going forward,
I
okay?
think I
Yeah.
followed that. I think
Oh, it didn't work?
Look what
Okay,
comes up.
I'm not accustomed to limits, but we did it before 4:30. yeah.
Is it-
Yeah, yeah.